The topic is patterns of African American migration in the United States, and we're talking to Dr. David Padgett, who is a geographer at Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Padgett, before we had our first commercial break, we were talking about some of the patterns of African American migration, and you indicated that primarily it was a movement from the South toward the West. But now what I'd like to talk about during this segment is what is generally considered to be the Great African American Migration, that migration that occurred between the census reports of 1910, 1920, and et cetera. Let's talk about it from that perspective. Let's have you to give us some information about this Great Migration.
Okay, yes, indeed. Yes, certainly the Great Migration, of course, is the one that we're most familiar with historically, where mass numbers of blacks left the South in the early part of the 20th century. Now, there were some push factors that differed somewhat from those that pushed the exodusters out. There were a lot of natural disasters that occurred in the early part of the century. There were floods. Black people lived primarily in low-lying areas. There was the boll weevil plague that wiped out cotton crops and put a lot of black people out of work. And so that, along with the racism and the rise of the Klan and land theft and lynchings, that was still there. That hadn't gone away. Those were push factors for pushing blacks out of the South. And what was interesting was that still at that time, in the early part of the 20th century, 90% of blacks lived in the South, and 80% of that population lived in rural areas. So you had primarily a rural to urban migratory pattern where you had people from rural areas going north, in this case of the Great Migration, to Chicago, to Detroit, to Cleveland. In fact, the black populations of some of those cities, such as Chicago and Detroit, actually increased 200–300% during that short period of time. And so the pull factors, what pulled black people to those cities, of course, were jobs, opportunities, more freedom, probably educational opportunities, all these things that they were not getting in the South. And so this was a significant movement, mass movement of black people.
Now, what impact did this have on the northern parts of the United States? I think you indicated that all of these African Americans, 90% are in the South, either Southwest and et cetera, but all of a sudden, within a 10-year period, they started appearing in Detroit and in Chicago, 200% increase and et cetera. How did the people in many of these areas, black and white, feel in reference to all these African Americans coming to these cities?
Well, in some cases, there was, of course, resistance by the white community. There was some vagrancy laws passed. Obviously, a lot of blacks did not get a job upon arrival in some of these cities, so they would end up out of work for periods of time. So you had these vagrancy laws where blacks would be jailed for being unemployed or vagrants. And so that was one reaction. What's interesting, as I saw in the Smithsonian Institution exhibit on the Great Migration, is that there was also resistance amongst northern blacks who saw themselves as being more refined and being or higher class than these Negroes from the South. And there were some types of behaviors or things that blacks in the South commonly did that were frowned upon by northern blacks, such as sitting out on the porch braiding a girl's hair. That was seen as being uncouth or talking loud. And so a lot of the parts of that exhibit in the Smithsonian Institution had old documents that northern blacks would hand the southern blacks about etiquette, how to act in public. And it was really interesting. I never thought that that would happen, but there was white resistance and somewhat of black resistance to these newcomers from the South.
And you know, we've often heard it said, Dr. Padgett, that many African Americans who were already in the northern parts of the United States, who represented a very, very small percentage of the population, really felt that they did not have a problem relating to the white population, but once these blacks from the southern parts of the United States, the many and the uncouth and et cetera, not only did it create a problem for the southern African Americans, but it also created a problem for the northern African Americans too. And so therefore they sort of resisted and resented some of these newly arrived. And I think, as you can probably testify, that the same thing probably happened to the new immigrants when we talk about the 1890s, when all of these immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And would you say that perhaps the African American situation from North to South might have been comparable to the Southern Eastern European situation coming to the United States? Would you see any kind of comparison in that as a geographer?
Yeah, perhaps to some degree, but in many cases, on the family level, I don't think there was resistance, because it was actually family members who were calling down south saying, look, come on up here, you know, there's opportunities, you know, so, and I'm pretty sure the same thing was happening with Europeans. If there were Europeans who would come here who said, called their cousins or whomever back home and said, come on over. But I think you probably had a small portion of the established black elite who offered resistance, but it wasn't resistance to the point that they were causing harm. That was unlike the vagrancy laws and other laws that were passed to crack down on the exploding black populations.
Too many, in other words, there were too many African Americans as far as the lawmakers were concerned, and of course, as far as their own members of their race was concerned, that they not only were there too many of them, they were bringing too many bad habits from the southern parts of the United States that was not necessarily approved by African Americans and the North. And of course, Dr. Padgett, I think that in a real sense, you came to us earlier and talked about these kinds of trends that occurred. Now, after the Great Migration, what's the status of the African American population in terms of its movement after that? Do they stabilize or whatever during this period?
Well, the Great Migration moved forward until, of course, the Depression. The Depression obviously slowed things down quite a bit. However, the Second World War brought forth a second movement as the boom times after the war resulted in an expansion of the secondary or manufacturing economy. Right after the Second World War, 99% of all the cars made in the world were made in Michigan, that one state. So there were lots of opportunities in the steel mills for African Americans with little formal education to come up and work with their hands and make a good living.
And so it was the industry that helped propel and helped to sustain, in a real sense, members of this great migration, that after they got there, there was something for them to do after they became adjusted and whatever. Very good. And of course, Dr. Padgett, we're getting ready for this second commercial break, after which we'll come back and we'll give you an opportunity to talk about some of the recent trends dealing with this African-American population. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Topic is patterns of African-American